probably be a little restless because people usually trickle in 10 minutes after the hour, which we call the academic quarter. So I had the great fortune to chair the second panel with three scholars who I have had the good fortune to work with in person. So it's a wonderful opportunity. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Ariane de Saxcé. Ariane received a PhD in archaeology from the Sorbonne University in Paris, Sorbonne 4. She has participated in numerous terrestrial and underwater surveys and excavations in France, the Near East, Egypt in particular, together with on Stephen Sidebottom's project, and South Asia, India and Sri Lanka in particular. Dr. de Saxcé's work on the intricacies of Indian Ocean trading networks and the complexities of intra-regional cultural patterns and identities is exemplary, I think. I've learned a lot from her work. It's quite extraordinary in its breadth. Her participation in several recent archaeological investigations, including the underwater excavations or exploration of the 1st century BCE Godavaya shipwreck off the southern coast of Sri Lanka, and the excavation of the seaport and settlement at Kuchaveli, near Trincomalee, has been, I think, a contributing factor in these projects' ongoing success. After completing her PhD, Dr. de Saxcé has been a postdoctoral fellow at the École Pratique des Hautes Études from 2015 to 2016. She's also been a member of the unit Archaeology of the Orient and the Occident at the École Normale Supérieure, and she continues to be affiliated with the CNRS, working in particular together with Osmund Bopearachchi on several projects in Sri Lanka. Today she's going to discuss networks of trade in the Indian Ocean, spatial analysis in exchange goods, and cultural appropriation. Please help me welcome Ariane de Saxcé.
Thank you so much, Sajid, for this introduction, and thank you for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I slightly changed the title. Is it okay? Yeah. So I would like to present today a few points related to the speciality of trade in the Indian Ocean and the distribution of goods that were imported, exported, or imitated in this area during the first few centuries of our era. This study relies on the quantified analysis of archaeological artifacts found in India and in Sri Lanka, as well on the western shores of the Indian Ocean. The cultural artifacts on which we'll draw our attention are small portable objects found in India and Sri Lanka that were likely to travel easily or that were similar to objects traveling from the west. So as a starting point for the reflection, I will focus on the information given in the Periplus of the Eritrean Sea, seen through its suggested networks of trade. Then I will come to spatial distribution of imports and cultural appropriations before concluding on exports and global networks. I've worked on the Periplus in a little particular way using the methods of social network analysis. Indeed, the type of information given by the author is presented as a closed network in which we can relate the different ports with each other via the goods that were imported or exported, that is mentioned on the text. Of course, the hypothesis at the base of this work is to suppose that the good that was exported by some place and imported by another might have actually traveled from the first to the second, even if with multiple stopovers or rerouting, as we will see in the graphs. So, first of all, let's start simply with the diversity of goods mentioned in the text and see what we can gather from that. Bahri Gaza appears immediately to be the main trading platform with the highest diversity of exchange goods, either imported or exported. Secondly, Adulis stands out as a major place of importation, and that points to its role in redistributing Eastern goods towards the Mediterranean. And the author doesn't mention goods going to the Mediterranean, maybe because this attention is drawn towards the Indian Ocean only. Other ports in Arabia, Africa, and South India have a rather fair balance of trade between imports and exports, except the southeastern coast of India, Arikamedu and other sites, Sopatma, Poduke, Kamara, which are only importing goods from the western coast. So they're goods reaching Muziris, then following the coast and reaching the eastern side. Sri Lanka, Central India, Bengal, China are mentioned only for their exports. So as far as the goods are concerned, aromatics and spices appear to have a big number of connections, as expected. So aromatics here, spices here. I've grouped the spices in this graph. In the next one, I've split each different category of spices. But tortoiseshell also appears to have to be central, which is usually less emphasized. Then I have gathered here and here all the information, all the lists given by the Periplus, and that gives a very dense network, which we'll see a little bit more in detail. As we saw, the port of Barigaza here stands out as the center of the network, with a very big number of imports and exports. So Barigaza and Adulis also appear, of course, in the graph by a multiple number of connections. And interestingly, the items of trade that appear to have the highest number of links are not pepper or gold, which are the main items that come to our mind, or wine. But grain, wine, and tortoiseshell. So they are at the center. That's what I wanted to show in the graph. Thank you. You cannot see the connections, but it doesn't matter much. So grain, wine, tortoiseshell. So normally I wanted to show you all the connections, but it's okay. Cotton also stands out, but it is less obvious in that graph because in the text it gives all the different details like garments, molokinon, cloth, etc. So as it is separated, it is not obvious in the graph, but it would be also one major connection item. Then money comes in a second position, and ivory, rice, ghee, they also appear in a central position. Pepper is only on the side. Here, as its source is unique on the western Ghats in South India. The northern coast of Africa is the green group here. South India appears in pink, so all this sub-network. And so they appear to be the very denser sub-networks. They don't seem to be there in that graph, in that visualization connected to each other directly, but via Central India or Arabia. If we try to find some path between these two, we don't find it, but we find it through Arabia. On the contrary, we have lots of connections between North Africa and... Okay. Sorry. North Africa and Western India via Barigaza. For example, through the exchange of ghee, exported and imported, and here as well, exported, imported. So Malao and Mundu, the ports of North Africa, and Barigaza here. Connections between Arabia and Africa as well. For example, through the exchange of ivory, myrrh, and frankincense. So ivory here, myrrh and frankincense between Kane and Musa and the ports of the northern coast of Africa. The last example here on that side might give an idea of how redistributing goods may have worked. As for example, some frankincense exported from Cannes. Cannes exports frankincense to Apologos, to the Gulf sites, and sorry, pass to the next. That's what I wanted to say. Sorry. Cannes exports frankincense. Frankincense goes to Apologos in the Gulf here, and Apologos exports wine, and wine goes to Muziris. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you go through. We know that they were not sailing around the coast of Arabia, but some of the things that were reaching here might have been sent on a mixed cargo to Muziris in a complex network. Thus, if we project the same graph on a map, supposing that goods create links between ports, the picture we get is far more complex than the traditional view which we usually have in mind. And it may help to put forward some major links, for example, between Central India and Africa, here, that appear in the text, but not in the references in Pliny or in the periplus of this direct route, and for which the quantity of material remains is still limited. Also, links between the Gulf and Arabia appear here, still depending on the information given by the author. So let's see now how the distribution of archaeological remains during the same period can complement this information suggested by the text. Before looking at the detailed maps, as we will see on this one, let's see the proportion of the material of which we are speaking, and that was very limited, as we were evoking it this morning. The quantification of archaeological artifacts may give a big amount in itself, but when you see the percentage of preserved vestiges among a category of local finds, it finally amounts to a very small percentage. So I've calculated the amphora compared to other ceramic assemblages, so it comes to very minimal percentages. Same thing for the sigillata, which is very, very limited. Coins, glass vessels, but that is based on the shape only, not on the chemical analysis. Glass beads will have more update, I think, in a few moments, and coral beads as well. So we're speaking of a very minimal amount of exotic items, and we have to bear in mind this small proportion for each site. Keeping this in mind, let's have a quick reminder of the main materials before getting into the analysis of categories of objects. Stratified coins appear in small amounts, of course, very small amounts compared to hoard finds, except on the site of Sigiriya in Sri Lanka. Here, that appears to be huge compared to others, because in that site they may have circulated probably as a main currency, but I'm not getting into this detail. The number of coins for early Roman and late Roman periods is similar and reflects the same geographical layout as for the hoards, with early Roman finds in India in yellow on the map, and late Roman finds in Sri Lanka. Amphorae finds reveal a predominance of coastal sites, as expected, with a huge proportion found in Patanam, Muziris. And noteworthy is the fact that they overlap to a certain extent in the Deccan with the location of Buddhist caves here in this area. That can be related to the involvement of the Buddhist communities in long-distance trade and the presence of foreigners in trade networks, as shown by the donors' names on cave inscriptions. The finds of bronze, glass, or sigillata vessels also reflect the importance of Patanam and Arikamedu as exchange centers, here and there, except for the stray finds of bronzes in Kolhapur, a famous hoard of Kolhapur here. So, to analyze the speciality of this material, I have preferred to group the artifacts not depending on the traditional material categories, but following their function, containing, ornamenting, or being valuable. The map of containers, in which I've included sigillata, amphorae, glass vessels, and bronze vessels, shows an overlap pattern on either amphorae and glass or amphorae and sigillata vessels, suggesting that the foreign wine, or maybe to a very lesser extent olive oil or garum, might have been consumed as well in foreign vessels, as mentioned in the Tamil epics evoking the beautiful vases used to drink the foreign wine. This pattern appears with an opposition between the Deccan and the south. In the Deccan, the finds enter into the land here, whereas in the south they are limited to the coasts, except for the capital Karur here. This might be related to the location of the Yavanas, the foreigners, confined in the south to certain neighborhoods in port cities, whereas they were integrated in the Deccan into the Buddhist trading communities. Interestingly, though, none of them reaches the very center of the peninsula. It is very obvious for the glass vessels. So on the left side, the finds of glass vessels, and on the right side, the density. The higher density is in orange and the lesser in blue. It may be due to the same reason as the Yavanas may not have reached the inside parts of the Deccan, or, of course, it could be due as well to the fragility of that material, which would have been difficult to move on great distances until the center of the peninsula. The map of ornaments includes coral beads, glass beads, gold and silver coin pendants, the Goulet. It reveals a completely different picture, with a higher concentration in the center of the peninsula and fewer finds on the coasts. The very big hubs for trade, such as Muziris, so here, or capitals like Python. So Roman glass beads would have probably been mixed with local Indo-Pacific beads, because it is not possible to differentiate it by their appearance. And they may have been traded locally in small markets, or they would have easily traveled on long distances. Similarly, coral beads are easily portable and could have constituted a precious item very far away from the coasts. So same thing here. On the spheres on the left side show the fine spots, and the patches show the density higher in orange. Moreover, the coral beads would have been included into Buddhist offerings, probably, as we can find it, for example, in Sri Lanka in the treasure of the Jetavanarama. And we see it here on Buddhist sites of the Deccan, like Ter, Kondapur, Sannati, Nagarjunakonda, and Vardamanu. Then the map of valuables corresponds well to the organization of trade of hoard coins of hoard coins, because most 2nd century coins are to be found in the central and eastern parts of this peninsula, and the 1st century ones are more in the southwest, and they are more bronze coins than gold and silver ones, more likely to have circulated than having been thesaurized, and they are located mainly in Sri Lanka. Bronzes like figurines and mirrors would have found their way well inside the land, like in Karur, in Brahmagiri, or in Ter. On the general map, which you saw at the beginning, we can observe that these three networks, containers, ornaments, and valuables, do not show much overlap. So on the map on the right, each of them seem to have its own logic and territorial organization, thus showing how much the local geopolitical and cultural contexts orientate choices and appropriations of objects. Rather than imagining a kind of Yavana package or foreign package in big trade hubs or capitals, we may consider different needs and cultural habits depending on the context. Only 4 cities belong to the 3 networks: Ter, Nagarjunakonda, I've put it together, There on the top, Nagarjunakonda, Alagankulam, and Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka. So contrary to what we could think, except for Alagankulam, they are not coastal sites, they are not capitals, except Anuradhapura, but they are points of contact and cultural connections, and they are also Buddhist sites. Once again, we find this connection between Buddhism and commerce. So that leads us to cultural connections and appropriations. And I would like to focus now on small portable objects likely to bear some connection with foreign artifacts, like the terracotta pendants called Goulet, which appear here in red, the molded ware in blue, the small terracotta figurines in green, and the jewels in yellow. The concept of appropriation seemed efficient to speak of these objects and renew our perspective by avoiding the idea of influence. That term is generally used in a contemporary context with when a main ethnic group borrows or reproduces the artifacts of a minority. In the antique context, the situation in India may have been quite similar, with small scattered groups of Yavanas bringing their own culture, and probably the local population may have wished to appropriate some of their habits or objects. That is what seems to appear in these different categories of objects. Here, a north-south opposition is clearly visible already, and we will see now the detail. Starting with molded ware, that is a specific production appearing in the Deccan around the beginning of our era and using the innovation of the double mold technique. Among different parallels suggested for this new type of ceramic, the examples from Ptolemaic Egypt seem convincing by the shape and by the lotus decoration, the long one, or what they call long petal balls. So here are the examples from Ter in the center of the Deccan. And that's the most popular decoration. This Egyptian connection is also valid for the terracotta figurines, among which I just picked few examples, but we see some similarities between the examples of central India on these female heads or children heads, and with Alexandria examples. Children heads that can be related to some fertility cults in both sides, probably. We find it as well on the grotesque category, very common in Alexandria, and for which we have examples in the Deccan, and on the figures of women in prayer or other figurines still belonging to fertility cults like the Lajagauri. I have not put it there. Their context is not well known in India, but in Egypt they could be domestic, votive, funerary, or they could be ex voto, which might be the case in the Deccan as well. We also find some figures of Yavanas, foreigners, maybe Yavanas with this curly hair. This head is, that kind of head stands out in the other categories of small figurines found in the Deccan. We also have horse riders looking like Central Asians, one Chinese, two Africans. So it seems that this group of figurines is like a figuration of a microcosm representing the macrocosm, meaning that the Yavanas, including there, were part of the circuit and day-to-day life in such crossroads cities like Ter. So Ter is the one which is really the hub here in the center. While figurines are equally present in the whole peninsula, a major opposition appears between the Deccan and the Tamil country for other artifacts. Thus, Goulet and molded ware appear to be limited to the Deccan, and molded ware is even limited to a few sites during a few centuries. It is not a standardized production, so the molded ware is there at the bottom right. This production probably remained something temporary and a local creation that didn't expand in the rest of central India or in the rest of the peninsula. Also restricted to the Deccan is the production of Goulet in terracotta. There is only one close to the south, but mostly all of them are located in central India. They reproduce mainly coins of Augustus and Tiberius, but sometimes twisting their features and making them resemble Satvahana kings. They belong to a bigger ensemble where we find auspicious images such as the elephant or Gajalakshmi. So could it be that the figures of foreign emperors would have been seen as protective as well? Maybe. In any case, such as small figurines reproducing the macrocosm, images of Yavanas are included in a bigger set of local auspicious symbols. They would have been part of a set of practices already present in the area. The terracotta ones are to be found in areas where real coins did not reach much. We don't find coins in yellow where we have mainly the bullae. So it might have been a cheaper and more accessible decoration where coins were not available. Among the jewelry in the south, we'll see that now the opposition between bullae in the center and the jewels in the south. There are no bullae, there are no terracotta imitations of coins, whereas we find some gold pendants similar to Ptolemaic coins. The opposition between the Deccan and the south is very obvious and could be part of a broader set of oppositions. So the jewelry we find in the south includes rings, intaglios, a few ear ornaments, one fibula, and interestingly we have inscribed seals and rings with personal names and honorific titles or clan symbols. The names are in Tamil and the symbols reproduce some emblems of the big dynasties of the south like Chola, the tiger for the Chola, or the fish for the Chera. It could be related to the specific social organization of the Tamil country based on clans, and borrow the traditional habit in the Roman Empire to inscribe a name or an emblem, like for example Victoria for the gens Cornelia, on a ring. Maybe that custom was adopted by local elites for prestige. The same may have been true of the adoption of key rings, here at the bottom left, which is also an innovation in this area, and the choice of a practice with a local motif, adapted with a local motif. In Sri Lanka, in Anuradhapura, on the upper left, one of them shows a woman with a tunic and with a veil that are very similar to a Greek tunic. And one intaglio Steve showed this morning made me think of that one. So as the microcosm in the Deccan, it may take its place among other local representations. In Sri Lanka you have lots of intaglios in carnelian like this of humped bull and local images, and among them, one of them is a probably foreign lady. And here is a summary of these inscribed rings with local names and titles and honorific titles showing that they may belong to officials or important places in Tamil society. So as for imports, this spatial distribution underlines the importance of cultural and socio-political choices in the appropriation and creation of new types of objects. The extreme south, governed by politics of gift and plundering in a clanic organization, give priority in their choice of appropriation to jewels and to practices more than to iconography. In the Deccan, it is a less luxurious practice where the Yavanas present through trade networks find their place in local representations and auspicious objects. Prestige versus accessible material, appropriation of practice versus appropriation of images. We're really in a process of differentiated selection and choices depending on the area considered. Let's see now what can be the image given by the material to understand the exports. They also show a similar selective process, so I just give a global picture. We'll go back on the detail of the graph and how I came to that. And to show the subnetworks and targeted networks. Drawing a graph of exports and imports together based on archaeological material is made difficult by the multiple possible origin of some of the materials. The source of some of them can be traced with precision, whereas others have multiple possible origins. Despite this difficulty, I tried to give one image of global networks. Traceable items include lapis lazuli, garnet, glass, sapphire, teak wood, some seeds, and some food like coconut, for example. The example of garnet is particularly interesting because it's a very one of the longest travel we know from South India, Central India, and Sri Lanka to the Merovingian France. It would have been traded as a raw garnet and used in the cloisonné type of jewelry in the 6th century Merovingian dynasty. Some type of garnet originates in India, the almandine type, and the pyraldine originates in Sri Lanka, which make it easily traceable. It stops suddenly in the 7th century, probably because of the trouble of the supply. Another example is the sapphire from Sri Lanka, which can be analyzed and followed until Rome. That is a famous example of a mummy found in Egypt on a Roman little girl of the 2nd century. She was buried in Egypt, where she was probably there because of a lung disease. And she was buried with sapphires from Sri Lanka, together with silk and an ivory doll. So these two routes are the longest routes we know, but we also have lots of traceable items from India and Sri Lanka to the Arabian and African coasts. One source which is very interesting, mentioned this morning, is the cotton. Because of this waving pattern of ZZ instead of SS, we can relate it to, identify it as Indian cotton, used either in sails or in decoration material, and it is quite common in Berenike and in Myosormos. Among the sources which are not unique, the Deccan is of course famous for types of chalcedony. So I mentioned here all the types which I have included in the graphs, all the products which we can more or less follow. So the chalcedony types, carnelian, agate, onyx, and sardony, mainly come from the Deccan sources, Deccan mines, but there might be some other origins as well. For here, I have privileged that source of the Deccan because it is most probable. In South India and in Sri Lanka, we know mine for diamond in Andhra, for sapphire and ruby in Sri Lanka, for beryl in South India, like in Padiyur, rock crystal, amethyst, and of course garnet. Chrysoprase is also there in Algan Kulam. Similarly, food items can have diverse origins, and they can also have been acclimated in Egypt for several centuries. So it is a little more difficult to follow. When India is one source possible, I have privileged it in the graph, but I will show you when several sources are there, I have also included 3 options. So yeah, I didn't stop on that, but I've selected these categories: the wood, textile, food, different kinds of beads, ceramics, black and red ware, coarse redware, paddle impressed, which we saw this morning, rouletted ware, redware, and the 2 coins mentioned this morning, which I've included there. So the way I've built the graph, which you saw at the beginning, is by matching one source and one target, trying to include all this information and all the finds of archaeological material on both shores. I have taken into account 3 possible sources, if I had, and I have coupled the information of the periplus and the information of the archaeological remains. So each item is numbered as a source and destination, and each line is unique for each category plus source plus destination. That's how we come to that result. It is quite different from the periplus, and that's why it's interesting to match the information, because here a strong link appears between Barigaza and Berkeley, which was not there in the periplus, which was emphasizing more the links between Barigaza and North Africa. And here we see also a little bit better the links between Egypt, Kusar al-Kadim and Berkeley, and South India. I've put it on the map, it will be easier. So this network appears a little bit stronger, and these networks appear as well. But what I found interesting in trying this to build these graphs is to put into relief the density and complexity of all the networks. But on this graph, the issue or bias is that the African coast, as opposed to the periplus, is underrepresented because I had less sources of archaeological material, less excavations, but probably that bias with more excavations should be compensated in the future to give a better global picture. And also the improving traceability of objects with chemical analysis could help a lot to improve that kind of graph and that kind of visualization of networks, so as to show the importance of subnetworks and local exchanges. Thus, the coupled information of the text and the archaeological remains applied to network analysis give us a picture of the importance of the local versus the global, the targeted exchanges versus the Western or Asian package of exotic items. Similarly, selective appropriations take place in the shade of this commerce, taking into account the socio-political specificities of each cultural area. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ariane, for underscoring the complexities of using just the periplus to reconstruct trading networks, and I'm sure that we'll revisit that particular issue in the discussion section following the papers. Next is, I'm again very happy and pleased to introduce James Lankton, who, in fact, just like Ariane, has been very instrumental in helping us make sense of the Kodabaya shipwreck. His work on the glass has certainly presented us with, if not a clear picture, a slightly clearer picture about place of origin and perhaps destination. Jim spent the first 3 decades of his professional career as an anesthesiologist, and only later, after working in the medical field for about 30 years, did he turn his attention to archaeology and the analysis of glass, for which I think we are very, very grateful, because without his work, we would really have a difficult time trying to piece together the movement of some of this material. He is currently, or he serves currently as an honorary fellow at the University College London. He has published widely on glass finds in the Near East, Africa, and Asia. And currently he is involved in 3 projects that are centered on the movement of glass across the Indian Ocean. The first is tracing Roman glass in the East. How did it end up there? What type of glass reaches and via which networks does that glass reach the East? He's also involved in a project on silver glass in Korea, specifically looking at some of the glass objects and analyzing them, trying to figure out how they, again, which networks sort of were instrumental in moving this glass into Korea specifically. And then his third project is focused on the Mediterranean and involves the analysis of Bronze Age glass in the Western regions, so to speak. Today he's going to help us try to make sense of the movement of glass in a paper entitled Roman Glass in Asia, What, Where, When, and Why. Please help me welcome James Lankton.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and to the organizers for the conference. It's really been very stimulating so far today. I hope it continues to do so. So we'll start today with this slide, which is actually a small, I think 5th or 6th century Buddha found in Sri Lanka, and based on other artifacts from the same place, we would guess that the eyes in this Buddha actually were made from Roman glass. So this is an example of Roman glass being used in Sri Lanka in a very prestigious situation. I'm sure they would have used only the very finest for making the eyes of this Buddha. So I think I'll change here. All right, so I'll also start with the Periplus, continuing the tradition started by Ariane and other speakers. And the Periplus mentions 4 types of glass. I think the Periplus is fantastic, and it's really the only source that we have for the exchange of Roman glass going to Asia. But we have to think about it as a snapshot of one person's experience, I think, because although the glass evidence certainly does back up a lot of what the Periplus says, that it expands beyond that as well. But in the Periplus, it talks about 4 different types of glass, Roman glass in the Indian Ocean trade. First being this Marini glass, very high prestige glass vessels made in Diospolis or modern Luxor near Thebes, going to Ethiopia specifically. Glass stones going to the African coast. Now, stone is a word that's been controversial in the Periplus as far as what that actually means. I think, to me, there's no question it means beads. I think in many languages, for instance, in Korean, the word for stone is often used as a replacement for beads. In English, we call beads pearls, and obviously they're not all pearls, but it's sort of a generic term. And I think stone is best interpreted in this way from the Periplus, because if you look at actually what's found in the ground, there's thousands and thousands of beads and very little else that could even be conceivably considered to be a stone of glass. The third category would be raw glass. This is a lump of glass that was found in an eastern desert fort, and I think exemplifies the type of raw glass that would have been traded in the 1st century mentioned in the Periplus. And then glassware, specifically going to northwest India. And this is a very nice ribbed bowl from Begram, Afghanistan, by mid-1st century. And then a beautiful blown ribbed bowl found in a Xiongnu tomb at Golmod in Mongolia, also dated to about the 1st century. So these are 2 examples of glass that probably came from the Indian Ocean trade to Bupearachchi at the mouth of the Indus, and then went up the Indus, going to probably to Begram, to Taxila, and then from there north into the desert route of the Silk Road, and then eventually to Mongolia. So archaeology in a way can be used as an illustration of text, and I think it works quite well in terms of the Periplus, so we can actually put illustrations to what's mentioned in the text. But I think there are other uses for archaeology as well. And I got interested, I never had been particularly interested, to be honest, in Roman glass, but I realized that we had all this data from Asia, probably over 10,000 analyses. So wouldn't it be interesting to look and see, how much Roman glass is there, if any, and where is it, and what can it help us learn about the exchange of glass across the Indian Ocean? Questions that are easy to ask are first, what do we mean by Roman glass? Roman glass, strictly speaking, was a very limited amount, and actually glass produced within the Roman Empire or within the Rome itself was very little. But most of the Roman glass was produced in the Levant and also in Egypt. So what do we mean by Roman glass? What were the types? And then where is it found? What was the chronological distribution? When was it found? And this speaks, I think, a lot to what Steve said about Bupearachchi, where there's a lot of later activity at the site. Do we find later Roman glass as evidence in Asia? And then the last question is sort of how and why, and obviously this is a much more difficult question to tell from the archaeological material, but can we look at, say, places where we have a lot of detail about the Roman glass and figure out something about sort of why certain types might have been preferred, maybe similar to what Ariane has done with Roman objects in India. I started with 6,000 samples that we'd analyzed. These are all from sites that conceivably could have Roman glass. So if it was too early or too late, I didn't include it. But so it's quite a large database, all with potential maritime connections. Most of these samples include trace elements, which is quite essential if you really want to get a good provenance for the glass. So just the major elements gives you an idea of whether it might be Roman glass, but in order to know for sure, you really need trace elements. We ended up with 636 samples of what I thought would be Roman glass from this original group, so about 10% overall. Most of the data is our data from Orléans, then data from Lord du Soubier at the Field Museum, and then other collaborators from Orléans, and Robert Brill, who's sort of the father of chemical analysis of glass, had done a lot of Roman glass as well. This is just an example of the kind of work that we're doing. So this is the LAICPMS Lab in Orléans. I won't go into detail here, but you can see it's kind of a room-size operation that requires pretty much a full-time engineer and then someone to run the equipment all the time. So it's a wonderful technique, but it is quite labor-intensive in terms of keeping things going. Once you know the lab is working well, you can actually do a quite rapid throughput of samples, and we can fairly easily do 100 samples a day if it's fairly simple glass. We get very good results for major elements down to trace elements in quantities of just a few parts per million. And in addition, the sampling is invisible. Just a brief review about sort of how Roman glass was made. The next couple slides are going to be a little bit dense, I'm afraid, so I'll go through them fairly quickly. If you have questions later, I'd be happy to answer. But basically, we think of Roman glass production as a two-component model. The main component is sand to give silica, which was kind of the backbone for making the glass. And then the second component was some type of flux to lower the melting temperature. So if you try to melt silica, it requires about 1,700 degrees centigrade, which was much too high for ancient technologies. So they added a flux, usually soda or sodium oxide, sodium carbonate, to lower the melting temperature. The sand mostly was beach sand from the Levant and also from Egypt. And the flux for most Roman glass was a material called natron, which was found it's an efflorescent salt found in Egypt, particularly at Wadi Natrun, but also at some salt lakes in the delta. Natron is a very, very pure source of soda, so there was soda plus not much else. In addition, we're now appreciating that in Egypt, even beginning in the 1st century, they were making a type of plant ash glass. We're using the ashes of usually desert plants or coastal plants to provide the soda. So these plants are very high in soda. If you ash them, then you can add soda. This also adds other materials as well that you don't see in natron glass. For instance, potassium, magnesium, and phosphate you find in plant ash glass, and that's how we can distinguish one type from another. The sand gives silica, but in addition, a number of trace elements. Lime, calcium is very important in glass because it stabilizes the glass structure, and otherwise the glass could melt in water. And there was enough lime in the sand, usually in the form of shell, to provide this. So this was not a third component that was added. It was really an accidental addition that just seemed to work out well for making Roman glass. At any rate, the resulting composition was, as you see here, mostly silica with about 15 to 20% soda. In natron glass, there's very little potassium and magnesium, and then lime around 7%, and alumina relatively low. Alumina's coming from the sand also, and then enough iron, about 0.5%, so that most of the glass naturally was tinged kind of a very light green, pale green, or pale blue. If you didn't want pale green or pale blue, you had to add something, and that was usually a decolorant like antimony or manganese. This oxidized the iron or counterbalanced the color of the iron so that you ended up with colorless glass. So colorless glass involved adding something to take away the iron color. If you wanted colored glass, otherwise you could add cobalt to make sort of a purplish blue glass, the color of that vessel from Begram, or you could add copper to make a blue-green or red, and then manganese for purple. So that's most of the numbers that I'm going to show today. 3 developments just in the recent years on Roman glass have been extremely helpful. I kind of thought that Roman glass had been done was one reason I didn't really get involved with it. But in fact, in the last few years, there have been a number of very interesting discoveries that really have helped and made possible this project on Roman glass in the East. The first was that the sand used for making Roman glass was different over the years. So initially, say the 1st to 3rd century, they used a very pure sand, both in Egypt, which is this group here, and then in the Levant. And then, for some reason, they changed to using a sand with higher impurities. Whether it was too difficult to get the pure sand, we don't really know. But with time, the Levantine glass developed higher levels of alumina, so this ratio of alumina to silica increased. More alumina in the sand meant more iron also, so that it was more difficult to make colorless glass. So more impurities, but it tells us that if we find glass that measures in say, this area over here, we know that it's later. Yeah, sorry. I think the pointer just...
No, it's there.
Oh, is it? Oh,
Yeah.
maybe I just can't see it from here.
Yeah.
Okay, anyway, you follow the blue arrow, and that's what happened over time. With Egyptian glass, starts out in the lower left-hand corner, then over time, you start getting other compositions based on the trace elements and based on alumina and titania. So this has given us a chronological key to when the Roman glass was made. So for instance, one problem with Roman glass in Asia is that most of the sites are not very well dated. So particularly in India and Southeast Asia, the sites are dated 2nd century BC to 10th century AD. It's not very helpful. But if you can date the glass, it's really a huge addition. And this has only become possible in the last couple of years. The second big development was the recognition that the compositions of plant ash glass vary by the geographical location of its production. And you can get this particularly by doing a plot of potassium versus magnesium. So natron glass is way down in the corner here where potassium and magnesium are both low. And then there are several kinds of plant ash glass. Sasanian glass from about the 3rd to 7th century is usually quite high in magnesium. So if the magnesium is more than about 4%, there's a good chance that glass is Sasanian. Central Asian glass, on the other hand, is very high in potassium, so that's a good indicator of whether the glass is Central Asian. Obviously, there's some overlap here in the 4% line. What we've just realized in the last couple of years is there's a significant amount of this plant ash glass, but actually being made in Egypt. So it's Roman glass, but it's a plant ash glass. At first, we thought this was only for the reds and greens used in the Roman mosaics from the 1st century that we saw pictures of. But it was also used to make colorless glass vessels, and a recent report on glass from a site in southern Egypt, just south of Luxor, showed that up to 50% of the glass vessels, say in the 4th to 6th century, were actually made with plant ash glass. So it's not just a small amount of plant ash glass. This is something that's very new and was quite helpful for this study on Roman glass in Asia. Sorry. Let's see if I can go back. Yeah. The third development was using trace element ratios here yttrium to zirconium versus and then cerium to zirconium to give us an idea of where the glass was made. In terms of major elements, the Egyptian glass and the Levantine glass are quite similar, and there's enough overlap you can't really say where it's coming from. But using the trace elements, we can get a good idea of whether the glass is Egyptian or Levantine. And this is very helpful for answering questions like, what was the Marini glass that they're talking about in the Periplus? I kind of thought it was similar to this imitation agate glass. Marini vessels were possibly agate or some type of banded stone, so I thought this is a perfect example of Marini glass. But when we actually tested this, these are some fragments from the Allard Pearson Museum in Amsterdam. It turns out that these vessels all have very high ratios, and in this pink area, it's pretty much all, thank you, it's pretty much all Levantine glass. So these actually are Levantine, not Egyptian, so they were not made in Diaspolus. Whereas this mosaic glass, which I wouldn't call Marini glass, is probably what the author of the Periplus was talking about. And these are all vessels that were found at Hais in Somalia, and that's where the Marini glass was traded, so it really matches very well with the Periplus. And you can see the ratios for these are all very low. So now we can distinguish whether the glass is Egyptian or Levantine, and that can be very helpful. So overall, our results showed that, as you saw, about 11% of the glass in our samples turned out to be Roman, which was actually considerably higher than I had anticipated. The most common types of Roman glass are gold glass beads, similar to these, greatly magnified, and then cobalt blue vessels, beads, and raw glass. So most of the raw glass chunks, or many of them, are cobalt blue. Many of the vessels are cobalt blue, and you can see the percentages here. So cobalt blue and gold glass seem to be the main themes of Roman glass going to the east. The gold glass beads we've seen some pictures of already, some from Berenike, I think from the 4th to 6th century stuff that Steve showed. And these are relatively common in Southeast Asia and particularly in Korea, as we'll see in a few minutes. So over 20% of the total Roman beads actually were these gold glass beads in Asia, which was quite surprising to me. Now, in terms of where the glass was going, obviously there was a very wide distribution going from the Red Sea to Korea and Japan. There wasn't very much Roman glass in India. At a couple sites, particularly Alagonculum was one, there's a higher percentage of Roman glass. There's Roman glass at Aricomedo, although not very much. There's a lot of Roman glass at Muziris, at Patnam Muziris. None of this has been analyzed chemically, but just looking at the types of vessels, it has to be Roman, basically. There's a lot of mosaic glass, a lot of rib bowls, many times more than has been found at Aricomedo. So it's really the largest archaeological assemblage of Roman glass found in India. In terms of types, in terms of Levantine versus Egyptian, 90% of the Roman glass being traded to Asia was coming from Egypt. And this was surprising also, because if you look at Roman glass in Western Europe from the same period, 90% of it is Levantine. So it's really the opposite ratio of what's going to Western Europe and what's going to Asia. I mean, if you think about it, it's not surprising the trade's going through the Red Sea. They're going to be using locally or regionally produced glass, but I think the results from our study show that this 90% of this glass is Egyptian. 64% of the samples were beads. There were a number of vessel fragments as well. Many of the vessel fragments are from places like Hais or from Edur, from sites closer to the Red Sea mouth, and fewer vessels in India, Southeast Asia, and then Korea. In terms of early and late, and I think this goes along well with what Steve was saying, although a lot of the samples are early, 1st to 3rd century, over 50% are later, 4th to 7th century. So the trade of this Roman glass, or in this case late antique glass, produced in the Roman tradition, continues well into the 6th century. Going to places like Southeast Asia and Korea. And in Korea, the samples are quite well dated, as we'll talk about in a minute. So there's a large amount of exchange, at least in glass. There's a lot of exchange in this later period. And that goes along very well, I think, with the data from Berenike, where you have a big increase in the mid 4th to 5th century. There's a big increase at that period in terms of glass exchange as well. Now this just shows in a map format where the Roman glass was found. The size of the circles does not really correspond to the amount of glass, but there are basically a number of sort of key areas where we find more Roman glass. One of these is, say, this is Begram here, but then probably in Taxila as well, going up into the desert route. This is Nia, the desert route of the Silk Road. There's a fair amount of Roman glass in this early period. So this is 1st to 3rd century. Barigaza was probably an important node also for glass coming in. Barigaza itself has not been excavated, but at places like Navassa and Ter, you do find Roman glass indicated here. This is Muziris here, some at Arikamidu, some early, in a small amount of early Roman glass in Sri Lanka, and then a lot of Roman glass in Thailand. Right from several sites right at the Isthmus of Kra, the narrowest part of the Thai Malay Peninsula. And at sites on both sides of the isthmus, the western side and the eastern side, there's really a concentration of Roman glass. And then in places like Korea, where we have the better data, and then also in Japan, there's Roman glass as well. There's not a lot in between, which is a bit inconvenient, but there is some in Bali, there's probably some in Malaysia. A lot of this, I think, is possibly due to the number of analyses that have been done and the sites that have been excavated, but it's difficult to make stepping stones going, say, from Southeast Asia to Korea. But it's going as far as Southeast Asia. There's really quite well-defined avenues for glass exchange. And one thing I wanted to point out that as opposed to the Periplus, which is having glass vessels going only to Barbarican, there's a lot of glass vessels at Patanam, ribbed bowls, and mosaic. And in Southeast Asia, right at the Isthmus of Kra, it pretty much mirrors the same kind of glass that's at Muziris. So there's Roman mosaic glass there. There are gold glass beads, of course. There are some fragments that probably are ribbed bowls, but there's very luxurious Roman glass going as far as Thailand. And I think this probably is the area that's known as Krise in the Periplus, or Suvarnabhumi in the Indian text, because there's no place else in Southeast Asia that really has anywhere near this quantity or even percentage of Roman glass objects. Now, slightly later, the picture changes. There's still a wide distribution. This is 4th to 7th century, but there's some later sites that develop. Late only is in blue, so these are later sites here. Some of the earlier sites, like say Barbarican, seem to be less important. You don't find after the 3rd century. There's not much Roman glass that's been excavated in Central Asia here or in northern Pakistan or Afghanistan. There's still Roman glass in the Muziris area. It's unclear how long Muziris continues to be an important port, but there was something there that was producing Roman glass. There's some late Roman glass. There are late Roman glass at the Isthmus of Kra area. Slightly different sites. They're about 100 kilometers south of the original sites, but large quantities of Roman glass. A few more sites, say in Vietnam, Cambodia, you find more Roman glass in the later period, and then going up into Korea as well. A lot of Roman glass in the late period. Now let's sort of switch gears for a minute and try to think about why Roman glass was important and sort of how it was traded. And here we're going to rely on the data from Korea. We have about 1,000 bead samples, glass bead samples dated from the 2nd century BC to the 7th century, most of which we've done with laser ablation LAICPMS. And of these, we picked out the Roman glass beads. All these samples are relatively well dated, which is not always true for the Southeast Asian samples, and they were all from excavated tombs. So it's all burial context, and well dated based on associated materials in the grave. So the dating is probably within plus or minus 50 years for most of these samples. So it's a great database to use if you want to be more specific about what's actually going on. Glass in Korea during this period was from a lot of different sources. There's a lot of Indian glass there, there's Southeast Asian glass, there's glass from Central Asia. It's coming from all over to Korea. It's kind of the end of the line of a number of trade routes, but there's a lot of Roman glass as well. And about 17% overall of the samples were Roman, which is, to me, was surprisingly high. And you'll see it's even higher in some sites. 87% of this glass is late. So there's certainly early Roman glass, but more than half of it was 4th to 6th century. So again, an indication that the trade really continued in a very healthy way into the 4th and 6th century. All of the Roman glass in Korea is Egyptian. There's Levantine glass relatively early, particularly the closer you are to the Red Sea, the more Levantine glass there is, and there's some in Thailand, but in Korea there's not any. Partly because it's later, I think, but partly because they weren't producing in the Levant what people wanted in Korea. 90% of the beads with Roman composition are either cobalt blue or gold glass. So again, the same theme, cobalt blue and gold glass is very strong in Korea as well. Before the 5th century or so, were basically, it's all ornaments. But then in the 5th century, there were a few cobalt blue Roman glass vessels found with some Central Asian produced Roman copies of Roman vessels, but these are really the only Roman vessels that we found so far in Korea. Kim Gyu-ho at Kongju National University was a huge help with getting most of these samples, which isn't that easy in Korea either. Just a quick political review of what's going on in Korea. This was in the 5th century, was what's called the Three Kingdoms period in Korean history, although there actually were 4 kingdoms that were important. And these would be Shilla in the southeast, and then Kaya in sort of central south, Baekje in the southwest, and then Goguryeo in the north. So Goguryeo the capital was around Pyongyang, and then Shilla capital at Gyeongju, and Baekje moved their capital several times. They were in Seoul for a while, and they kept getting pushed south by Goguryeo. Finally, in the 5th century, the capital was at Gyeongju. So we'll talk about these again. So it was sort of this 3-kingdom structure with relatively fluid geographic boundaries. Sometimes they were fighting, sometimes they were cooperating. Okay. Just wanted to show some pictures. So this is cobalt blue glass beads found from Korea, and there's, as you can see, a lot of them. These are the early ones, probably 2nd century, and most of these actually are not Roman. These are Indo-Pacific type, so they're small drawn beads, and you very seldom find Roman beads made in this way. So this is almost all South Asian, Indian, and Southeast Asian glass. But by the 4th to 6th century, I think this is from Bokchungdong, it's 4th century, you start to see larger beads and more spherical, and most of these are going to be Roman. So the Roman beads looked a bit different, and you find them mostly later for the cobalt blue. These are a nice image from a recent video that was on Korean television for some blue glass beads. So you can see, I think, from this picture some of the attractions of beads from this color. So it was something that the people really liked. In terms of gold glass beads. Okay, all right, good, thanks. This is just some pictures of gold glass beads. These are some of the early ones here. These are probably 2nd to 4th century. You can see gold glass combined with other colors with carnelian beads as well, and then a Korean ornament. This is a nice close-up of gold glass beads. Shows how they're made. They probably were made as a tube of colorless glass with a very thin layer of gold over it. By some means, they put another tube of glass over the outside of this, and then because ordinarily to make small drawn beads, you take the tube and you just cut it. But if you try to cut this sort of tripartite structure, it splinters. So they had to be made narrow first. So the tube was then, while it was hot, it was segmented into beads, and then that smaller area could be cut easily without splintering. So they were a segmented type of bead. These are some later gold glass beads from a royal tomb near Gongju. It was a Baekje tomb, and you can see that some of these are left as long segments, up to 10 or even more beads still attached, and then some of them were separated into separate beads. So these are not to scale, so these beads are probably about the same size as the ones in the other pictures. So this is kind of what the gold glass beads looked like. If you look at the types of glass that was found in Korea, a lot of it is cobalt blue. So in terms of the glass beads, only in some periods over 50% of the beads were cobalt blue. So it's very striking when you go to a Korean museum or an archaeological site, and particularly early, and you look at the glass, you're just struck by how much cobalt blue there is. The gold glass was also quite significant. So over 10% of the beads at some places, and particularly here in the 2nd century, a dip down when Berenike was pretty much the same period when Berenike was more quiet, and then another peak here in the 6th century. And much of this is due to one royal tomb, that Moryong tomb that we showed a picture of. But there's more gold glass coming in later. In terms of how much of this is Roman, most of the gold glass is Roman. In the 2nd century, there were some Central Asian gold glass beads coming in, but by the 6th century, it's basically all Roman. All of this cobalt blue glass here is not Roman, but instead some of the 4th and 5th century cobalt blue is Roman. And in the 5th century here, you can see that, in fact, most of it's Roman. So you have a big change in the amount of cobalt blue Roman glass that's coming in, and it's really basically all coming in this 4th, 5th century area. So you have an interesting picture here where the early Roman glass is all gold glass beads, and then later is a mixture of cobalt blue and gold glass. So there seem to be definite patterns here chronologically that we can see developing. The gold glass early was in sort of all areas of Korea, and then later the gold glass was no longer in this Shilakaya area, but instead was in the Baekje area. So there are chronological divisions, but also political divisions in terms of the distribution of the Roman glass. One thing that's interesting in terms of Korea is that although there is a lot of gold glass beads, there's no gold. Until the 4th century, early 4th century, the earliest, you start to see a few gold artifacts. Most of these are in the Baekje area, and they tend to be very small earrings, gilt bronze, and then gold pendants. This is a pair of Puyo style. Puyo was a kingdom in what's now Manchuria, but probably had some influence on the Korean kingdoms. These are actually Puyo artifacts that were found in Korea. One very nice piece is this combination of gold and glass. And the combination, the use of gold and glass together, I think gives some idea of what the prestige was of this glass material. And this is often true in places where glass is rare. Gold and glass are often combined together because they were both very valuable objects. This was true in ancient Egypt, say in the New Kingdom Egypt, where you find on the gold mask of Tutankhamun, many of the inlays that appear to be lapis lazuli on the golden mask are actually glass. So glass was used along with gold, and that was certainly true in Korea as well. So whatever the value of the glass beads was at their point of origin, by the time they got to Korea, they were very, very, very valuable. And they're mostly found in royal tombs. So very high prestige objects. And this use of gold and glass together, I think, is an illustration of that. So in a place where there's no gold, what is the role of gold glass? What did this mean to the people is a question that came to me. And let's look a little more closely about the patterns that emerge in the data from Korea. So I think one thing that's interesting is that there's this kind of either-or pattern where they either have gold glass or they have cobalt blue glass, but they don't usually have both together. And as I said, it's kind of an early versus late, and it's also a geographical distribution, sort of southeast Kaya and Shilla versus Western Pekche. These are royal tombs or cemeteries, so these are all very high prestige items. And in the sort of 3rd century here and 4th century, this is Kaya in the south, up to 16 to 18% of the total beads from these cemeteries were Roman gold glass beads. So a very high percentage. By the late 3rd century, you're starting to see a marked decrease in the amount of gold glass and a beginning of cobalt blue. So this was a late 3rd century, this is late 4th century. You start to see this gold glass falls off, and you have cobalt blue glass coming in. And then in the later 4th century and 5th century and then 6th century graves, you have a predominance of cobalt blue glass beads. So up to 60% of the beads in this one royal tomb were actually Roman. So that's an incredible amount considering the distance from which the Roman beads were coming and the plethora of other sources that were probably available. So there were lots of beads that they could have had from India or from Southeast Asia, but they were using Roman beads instead for these highest prestige tombs. Finally, there's this tomb on the right. This is a 6th century tomb for King Muryong. This is a Pekche tomb, and there were a lot of beads, as we'll see, but they weren't cobalt blue, they were gold glass. So we'll look at more closely at 2 tombs. This is the King Muryong tomb, and this is a tomb in Shilla called Hwangnom de Cheong, which is one of the earliest of these giant mounded tombs that you may have seen pictures of. And if we compare these two, it may help us in some ways understand what the meaning or the importance of the Roman glass was. So this is Hwangnom de Cheong on the left, which was a double tomb, probably husband and wife, they think. The earliest mound was probably very late 4th or early 5th century, and then the second mound was put in about mid-5th century. And here, there's lots of gold. Everything's gold. Shilla was called the Golden Kingdom. There's golden crowns, golden belts, golden necklaces, huge amounts of gold. But there's no gold glass beads, which is strange. I mean, to me it seems strange that they would have. Why not? Why didn't they want gold glass beads? But they had all this Roman glass that was cobalt blue. So it wasn't a question of no Roman glass. They just didn't have the gold glass beads. These seem to end around the early 4th century, but they don't go any later than that. So, with so much gold, maybe was the gold glass no longer interesting for them? Obviously, they still liked Roman glass because of all the cobalt blue beads, but no gold glass. And I wonder if you consider the gold glass beads were kind of like a gateway drug toward gold. So they had gold glass beads for 300 years. It wasn't a short period of time. And then all of a sudden they found the real thing, and gold glass was gone. Or was it a question of, as some people have thought, new people coming in? So were the Shilla royal family newcomers from Central Asia? That's sort of those 2 themes in Korean archaeology that are greatly debated with no conclusion. I think the glass evidence here to me says that chances are it was new people coming in, because you don't go from a few gold glass beads to so much gold in 1 or 2 generations. It just doesn't seem possible without an influx at least of new thinking, if not some new people. Now in Pekche, the situation was different. Sure, Pekche was a rich kingdom, there was a lot of gold, but it's not in the same obsessive manner that there is in Shilla. So there are crowns. The crowns are usually gilt bronze, not gold. There's one very small gold crown, a lot of small gold ornaments. So pieces of gold, but not in great profusion. But you still see gold glass beads. They still seem to be interesting. On the other hand, no cobalt blue Roman beads. So it's a very different pattern from what's going on in Shilla. But can we consider the use of, say, gold glass to be more evolutionary than revolutionary in Pekche, where they still were interested in the gold glass beads, but they had this other gold as well, so they enjoyed both. So I see a difference between these 2 areas. I'm not quite sure what it means. One possibility would be kind of Roman glass as a prestige object and the idea of branding. So the Roman glass beads, the later ones, cobalt blue, as I said before, were larger, they were more round. Maybe they were more desired on that idea. So, if you had the round, big ones, those were more expensive, those were more prestigious than the small Indo-Pacific ones, with which now they had almost no interest. In terms of gold glass, was it a question of liking the color, or was it a question of liking the material? It's hard to know. Certainly in Paekche they had gold glass beads in this later period, but not in Silla. So the idea of commodity branding is one idea that I had. Another idea, and I think this is probably important, although I'm not quite sure how, and I think maybe similar to what's going on in India, and that's the role of Buddhism. So this was the period also during which Buddhism became accepted in Korea. Now the timeline was different in Silla than in Paekche. So in Silla, in this Wangnam-dae Chong tomb, there's these huge necklaces that are so big they call them chest lace, because they fit over the chest. There are all these cobalt blue beads, and then gold beads, actual gold beads, no gold glass, gold spacers, very elaborate and very, very luxurious looking ornaments, in addition to the gold crowns and everything else. So in Silla at this period, Buddhism had not been accepted yet. There's no evidence for Buddhist anything really in Wangnam-dae Chong. 100 years later in Silla, yes, you do start to see some Buddhist influence, but at this period, no. It's more a continuity, I think, with the emphasis that they had before on cobalt blue glass. That continues. So we saw cobalt blue in Kaya in early Silla, and that continues then with later Silla. The other colors were really much less common. Now, in King Moryong's tomb, on the other hand, from the early 6th century in Paekche, there's beads of every color. So these are some of the beads from the King Moryong tomb. Now, in here you can see some gold glass beads, some silver glass beads here. So they were mixed in with the other colors. So there no longer is this emphasis on cobalt blue in Paekche. And in fact, Buddhism had been introduced to Paekche probably in the late 4th century. So by the time of this tomb, Buddhism had been around and was kind of a state religion for almost 100 years. The beads of many colors, could they have represented something like the Buddhist 7 treasures, where we know from evidence from India, Sri Lanka, China, that glass beads could stand in for all of the 7 treasures: gold, silver, carnelian, lapis lazuli, etc. Gold glass made a very good imitation for these, and that may have been one of the functions, I think, of these gold glass beads, that were a less expensive, more accessible form of gold for the 7 treasures. So here, I think there's something tied in with Buddhism and the adoption of Buddhism to why, the Roman glass was still prestigious, but it was used in different ways in different parts of Korea. I know it's not a very satisfying answer, but I think it's difficult to answer questions of how and why with archaeological materials. But I think this gives us some ideas of where that might be going. All right. Here we have kind of a review of what we talked about. So in terms of what was being traded, we know there was raw glass, there were beads, there were vessels, following the pattern more or less of the Periplus, but the Periplus is quite specific. This commodity goes there and not there, whereas we see everything going everywhere in the actual evidence. So Periplus, I'm sure, was that writer's experience, but probably not the experience of everyone, because the archaeological evidence does illustrate the Periplus, but it also extends it beyond. So I think that's something we have to be careful with, obviously, with any kind of text. It can give even the most accurate, gives a very accurate picture of experience, a snapshot of experience, but doesn't cover everything you're going to find. The distribution was very wide, and this, I think, is surprising. If you think about 1st century Roman glass in Korea, that's very quick. For glass to have entered into what were probably pre-existing trade routes. We know from the Goulet there was already exchanging glass ingots in the 1st century BC. So having Roman glass was not that different. It was the same, the same type of material, going some of the same places. So the trade routes were already established, and then the Roman materials came into them. So the distribution was very wide. There seems to be definite nodes at Patna Muziris and also in the Isthmus of Kra. Surprising, I think, was the samples were so evenly divided between the 1st to 3rd century, and then the later period, 4th to 6th century. In places like Korea, almost 90% of the glass was actually later. In terms of how and why, it's more difficult to answer. I think you need post-grained data, like the data from Korea, in order to really even start to answer these questions. But I think some things that come to mind to me are sort of thinking about exchange as sort of a pull or a push mechanism. You might think, well, they put Roman glass on the boat and then people were delighted to have it. I think that picture is probably much too simple. So that a lot of what was traded was actually pulled by the consumers. So there's no point in putting something on the boat if people are not going to buy it. So I think it was more than just taking Roman stuff and selling it. There had to be something specifically interesting about the materials that were shipped. And this would have been tied probably to local cultural and political developments, whether it was in terms of kingdoms, of geography, of religion. But there were local factors that were very important in the trade. And the same thing that Ariane was talking about for India. This may have parallels in terms of the market knowledge that's described in the Periplus. Certainly the author of the Periplus was familiar with what the markets wanted in the various places. No reason that sort of information would have continued. But going as far as Korea is really a stretch. It's a lot farther than the Indian Ocean. Going to Korea was a lot farther than going to Muziris. But that type of information was probably available at the time. And I wonder if this implies a more intimate contact between the people at these proximal, either if not source, then proximal trading networks and the final consumer, say in Korea. Did someone from Thailand go to Korea? Would that have been necessary to get this information through, or could it have been done by smaller regional networks and then traded down? I think that's a question that's good to ask. I don't really know what the answer is. So I think the regional webs were important, certainly, but in order to match production and exchange to this extent, I think it would have been probably necessary to have some level of long-distance integration as well as the regional knowledge. And I just want to have some acknowledgments. This glass study is something that you really can't do by yourself. It takes a village. Someone has to study the sites, to dig up the glass, to get the samples, and analyze it. And there are probably hundreds of people whose effort are in the data that I presented today. But I wanted to single out a few here. Osmund and Ariane are in the audience, and they've been very helpful with samples and with helping to understand what the data mean to the Tang Center for the staff here for the conference. I wanted to mention also Ian Glover, who some of you may have known about or knew, who recently died a couple weeks ago while on holiday in Sicily. He sort of got up from breakfast and died unexpectedly. But he's encouraged me a lot in my work. So he introduced me to UCL at first, and I think has had a very important role in terms of recognizing how important glass study could be to archaeology. It's one of the early ones to really do that. So just wanted to say a word about him as well.
To the material. Welcome.
Thank you very much. So, I'll be, when Sanjot asked me to give a paper, I was hesitant between two, whether I should talk about the circulation of coins for the trade or the new research that I'm doing on the Buddhist iconography. So I thought this should be quite interesting. So both maritime and inland trade brought peoples of many cultures, languages, beliefs and aesthetic aspirations together. Traders were to a certain extent the mediators of these cultural interactions because Buddhist monks, nuns, philosophers, artists and diplomats as well traveled together. As a result, not only goods, but also philosophical thoughts and iconographies were exchanged. Buddhism and Jainism favored profit-based trade more than the Hinduism. The Orthodox Hinduism did not encourage seafaring. The Buddhayana Sutra, one of the Dharma Shastra, quite explicitly says that, quote, making voyage by sea is one of sins causing loss of caste. A seafarer is put into the category of someone with an evil disease, a poison vendor, or a lover of one's sister-in-law. Concerning, it's translation by Patrick Oliver. Concerning the Jainism, one may argue that in spite of many stories related to the seafarers well studied by Phyllis Granoff, the Jain tradition has not left much iconography to study the evolution of maritime trade. Eminent scholars present here have discussed and will continue to discuss tomorrow the importance of the archaeological evidence, mainly coins, metals, ceramics, glass, we just heard James, beads and jewelry, seals and ceilings, to understand the growth of trade activities. Why then the necessity to study Buddhist iconography? It is not an exaggeration to say the Buddhism encouraged the trade and appreciated donations by rich merchants. Apart from hundreds of inscriptions announcing the contributions and Buddhist texts reporting with admiration the donations made by rich merchants, the Buddhist complexes, the Buddhist iconography, sculptures, paintings and ex voto, helps us to evaluate the dynamics of trade and the chronological and geographical orientation of routes. There are many stories in Buddhist literature concerning the merchants set into sea to gain wealth. In a Purva Yoga, written in Gandhari and studied by Timothy Lenz, it is said that Buddha was a merchant, Samudra Vanija, of great ocean, Mahasamudra, and he set out on the great ocean with supplies collected by him. There are many depictions in ancient art highlighting the generous gift of Anathapindika, supposed to be the wealthiest merchant in Shravasti, who purchased the Jetavana Park for the Buddha by covering it with coins. The railing of the Bharat Stupa, dated to the 2nd century BCE, has two depictions and one with the legend. The North Torana of Great Sanchi Stupa, dating back to the 1st century BCE, has more elaborate depiction of Anathapindika's story. Recently discovered Kanaganhalli Stupa has two depictions of the story. One panel gives more details about the organization of the monastic complex offered to the Buddha and by Anathapindika. I believe this popular story was used to promote the generosity of Anathapindika so as to encourage other wealthy merchants to do the same to gain merits. The spread of Buddhism from South Asia to Southeast Asia is closely connected with the growth of the maritime and fluvial networks. Looking at the distribution pattern of the early Buddhist settlement sites, we realized that they were inland and clustered around the big rivers flowing to the Indian Ocean. Kautilya, in his Arthashastra, talks about the superintendent of shipping whose role was to maintain the fleet of small and large sailing vessels to support maritime enterprises, allowing the movements of goods as well as the trade along the rivers and waterways. The fluvial transportation in ancient world was less dangerous and less expensive than the land routes. All the Gandharian Buddhist sites built around the Upper Indus Valley and its tributaries Kabul and Swat rivers. Vast Buddhist complexes in North India like Mathura, Vaishali, Sarnath, Nalanda and Bodh Gaya are situated either in the vicinity of the Ganges or of its tributaries like Yamuna and Niranjana rivers. The Buddhist sites of the Satavahana and Ishwaka periods like Amaravati, Nagarjunakonda, Granthashala and Jakapedia in Andhra Pradesh are located along the Krishna river. Likewise, ancient capitals and Buddhist complexes of Sri Lanka were inland, but each had one port on the coast. Manthai, the most active port in ancient Sri Lanka, was located close to the Malvatoya, which linked the port to the inland capital of Anuradhapura. The location of the ancient capital of Polonnaruwa, the second one, on the banks of the Mahavali River, which flows to the sea at Gokarna, is no coincidence. Polonnaruwa was built as a capital when the maritime trade networks connecting Southeast Asia and China became active. Nearly 3,000 stupas and monasteries were built in Bagan at the left bank of the Irrawaddy River in Burma. Dwaravati, Sukhothai and Ayutthaya complexes were established along the Chayaphraya River in Thailand. In central Java, the Proga River runs to the southeast, passing near the well-known Buddhist sites like Candi Borobudur, Candi Mendut and Candi Pawan. The prosperity and the duration of these monastic sites depended mainly on the dynamics of maritime trade and fluvial network, because traders as major donors played an immeasurable role in the spread of Buddhism and the construction of monastic complexes. On the widespread and gigantic Buddhist cave complexes of the Deccan Plateau in Maharashtra are an exception, because the traders who sponsored this sumptuous dwelling of the Buddhist monks followed the land trade routes. The Western Ghats, being too close to the littoral, there aren't major rivers fall into the Arabian Sea. Instead, they all flow eastwards. The reputation of Avalokiteshvara offering protection to the traders taking the perilous land routes gained much popularity in the Buddhist cave sculptures depicting the Ashtamaha Abhaya Avalokiteshvara, in which the Bodhisattva protecting human beings from the 8 great perils. Traders taking the dangerous land routes needed the Bodhisattva's protection from the enraged animals, poisonous reptiles, wild beasts, evil spirits, captivity and slavery, sword of the enemy, and devouring fires. Only 1 out of 8 perils is dedicated to the seafarers who face the danger of shipwrecks in the turbulent sea. The choice of Jataka and Avadana stories depicted in paintings and reliefs of Ajanta, Ellora, Borobudur, Pagan, and many other Buddhist complexes reflects the aspirations of donors who sponsored them. The stories connected with the fear of sea monsters and terrestrial demons, yakshas, rakshas, and pretas, were the major threats and the enemies of mariners who ventured into the perilous ocean and dangerous foreign lands in search of wealth. This may be the reason why in Sri Lanka most of the mural paintings of the Kandyan period temples, which I consider as the continuation of such ancient painting tradition dating back to the 5th century, depict the Jataka stories like Telapatta Jataka, where the terrestrial demons, Yaksha, Rakshas, and Pretas dominated the plot. If we believe the story narrated in the Deepavamsa, the oldest Pali chronicle, the reason behind the Buddha's visit to Sri Lanka was to uproot the Yakshas, Bhutas and Rakshas and establish a peace in the island and cause it to be inhabited by men. The echoes of this island inhabited by Rakshas and Rakshasis devouring the shipwrecked mariners can be seen in the story of the Simhala depicted on the right wall of the cave number 17 of Ajanta. The story of Simhala is found as the Valhassa Jataka, cloud horse Jataka, in the Jataka Mala, as Dharmalabdha Jataka in the Mahavastu, the Simhala Avadana in the Divya Vadana. It also has many other later versions, particularly Jain and Nepalis. The story as narrated in the Jatakamala partly takes place in the island of Rakshasis, identified as Sri Lanka. The bloody, thirsty Rakshasis take a human form to attract the mariners who have survived from the shipwrecks. Simhala, the merchant leader, in virtue of his merits, quickly realized at night that these beautiful women were Rakshasis, who ate humans or cast them into a house of torment. The Bodhisattva, identified as Avalokiteshvara in the later Mahayana versions, possessed with supernatural powers, appeared in front of Simhala as a flying horse and rescued the mariners and took them home safely. The story of the merchant Simhala became popular among the mariners and traders who travel in the Indian Ocean, known for all kinds of life-threatening cyclones, high monsoon winds, and severe thunderstorms. The fear of the unknown in foreign lands gave birth to the legends of ferocious yakshas, rakshas, and pretas. The sculptures depicting the Ashtamahabhaya Avalokiteshvara evokes the dangerous land routes and the constant fear of shipwrecks. The Buddhist iconographies left by traders, donors are, after all, appeals for the protection from the blessed ones to reach their home safely. I believe these iconographies represent an essential part of maritime trade that we seem to forget quite often. Who were these mariners, traders, and merchants? Thanks to the literary sources and archaeological evidence that we discussed this morning, we know to a certain extent the ethnicities of mariners and merchants who ventured into the Indian Ocean. As trade routes evolved from the coastal to direct navigation and the fluctuations of destinations with the decline of certain empires and the rise of new political powers, the ethnicities of mariners also changed. Some mural paintings and sculptures also enable us to guess their identity. Like today's selfies, these generous traders have left their portraits in the Buddhist art sponsored by them. Let us go to Ajanta once again. The male figure seated in the middle of the scene, holding a wine-drinking cup and surrounded by his entourage, depicted on the ceiling of the cave number 1, as correctly identified by Monica Sin, is Kubera, as one of the Chatura Maharajakas, or the 4 great kings of the 4 directions, and the king of the northern quarters. He is dressed in Persian garb, a long tunic, belted at the waist. Apart from his cap, the fluttering streamers emanating behind the head evoke immediately the Sasanian kings. The beriband diadem is first found on the coinages of the Parthians and continued under the Sasanians. Many of the Sasanian reliefs depict Ahura Mazda investing the ruler by handing him a Beriban diadem. Likewise, the same iconography can be seen on the coins of Ardashir I and his successors like Shapur I. This cheerful Kubera, drinking like the Persian nobles, dressed like them, had been served by Persian women, also in Persian attire, with fluttering ribbons, is a self-portrait of a rich Persian merchant. Among many paintings, in the cave number 17, the story of Udyana and Gupta is a special one. Udayin was a courtier of Kapilavastu and messenger of King Suddhodana. He fell in love with Gupta, widow of the minister's son in Shravasti. They are depicted as having a happy time in their palace, attended by many servants. And among them, one serving them wine is once again a Persian. He is also dressed like a Sasanian and holds a Sasanian type wine jar. His discreet intrusion into the picture is quite remarkable. There are many other such depictions of Persians in Ajanta paintings. In the 5th and the 7th century CE, Perso-Sasanians were very active traders. No wonder why Vajrapodhi, the Indian Buddhist monk who later became an esoteric Buddhist teacher in the Tang dynasty, encountered on his way to China 35 Persian vessels in Bosili, Beruala, in Sri Lanka. Sasanians were trading in precious stones in that country. Among many other ethnic groups attested in Ajanta paintings, the descent of the Buddha at Samkasha from Triatimsa, the delegation headed by the King Udyana has many of such non-Indian, perhaps Ethiopian or Egyptians. Before the Sasanians entered into the Indian Ocean trade, Parthians, Scythians and Kushans were active during the first 3 centuries CE. The pillar from the site number 37 of Nagarjunakonda, now in the site museum, has a depiction of a Scythian. He is shown wearing a long-sleeved tunic over a tight trousers, belted at the waist and wearing a Phrygian cap. He holds a drinking cup, the function of which can be understood looking at the lower register where 3 women dance in front of 2 containers. 2 depictions of men wearing a knee-length, long-sleeved, high-collar tunic belted around the waist and worn over a baggy trousers, shalwar, with horizontal folds to the ankles and holding a long spear look more like Parthian or Kushan. The lower register depicts a man seated on a couch served by a woman. The containers under the couch are certainly meant for alcohol. No wonder why many amphorae containing wine were found in southern India, very particularly in Pattinam on the Periyar Delta in Kerala that Ariane spoke of, in Arikamedu and in the lower Krishna Valley. The great stupas of Amaravati, Kanaganhalli, Nagarjunakonda and many other in the Krishna Valley symbolized, like many Buddhist monuments in North India, such as Sanchi and Bharut, the political and economic supremacy of the ruling dynasties. Resources needed to build these monuments would have come from the devout mercantile classes of Buddhists who were well established in Dhanekatika. Apart from commercial interactions, the cultural and religious relations between Andhra Pradesh and Sri Lanka drew the Buddhist communities closer. So much so that a branch of the Mahavihara from Anuradhapura was established in Sihela Vihara in Nagarjunakonda. Another Buddhist sect from Sri Lanka was at the Chuladandagiri Vihara. I have discussed elsewhere in detail the impact of the Andhra motifs on early Sri Lankan art. The panels depicting the scenes from the life of the Saxcé Muni and the earliest images of the Buddha found in Sri Lanka were imported from Andhra Desha by traders when visiting the religious monuments on the island. These imported sculptures so far attested on the island can be divided into three large chronological groups. The sculptures executed during the second phase of the high period of Amaravati, close to the downfall of the Satavahana dynasty at the beginning of the 3rd century CE, belong to the first chronological group. And these are some of them from Anuradhapura Bigiri Bodhigara, and this was found recently, I have discussed this elsewhere, from Tisamaharaman. The sculptures belonging to the Ishwaka period in Nagarjunakonda, late 3rd and early 4th century, belong to the second chronological period. The third chronological group belongs to the post-Ishwaka period, 4th and 5th centuries. And there are many, I'll show you only few of them. The Kantaka bidding farewell, and this was very recent, about a year ago, a depiction of universal monarch. And these, images of the Buddha and also Bodhisattvas, and also the twin miracle. And this one also I discussed quite often, about 7 weeks after the Enlightenment. Like the panels depicting the scenes from the life of Saxcé Muni, the first images of the Buddha were also imported from Andhra Desha. The stylistic features of these sculptures inspired all the standing images of the Blessed One until today. The earliest forms of Sri Lankan art are directly inspired by the Andhra prototypes. They are limited to few sculptures from Abhigiri and Jetwanarama stupas depicting some events from the life of the Buddha, such as the presentation of the newly born Bodhisattva to Sakyavardhana, Indra and Brahma pleading with the Blessed One to reconsider his decision not to preach, the exhortation of the gods to the Bodhisattva to descend from the Tusita heaven, and Sarvam Jataka. All early iconographies of Sri Lankan art were inspired by the Andhra prototypes, such as the zoomorphic Nagas and anthropomorphic Nagarajas and Naginis and Purnagata. Sri Lankan artists and rich merchants who have commissioned them seem to have preferred the depictions of Chakravartin, the universal monarch, because according to the legend, when he raises his right hand, coins drop from the sky. The earliest known painting in Sri Lanka, dating back to the 3rd century CE, is of a Kubera, Lord of Wealth, the god king of the semi-divine Yaksha in Hindu mythology, usually depicted with a plump body. Many earlier sculptures in Sri Lanka illustrate him associated with coins. 2 statues of Sankanidhi and Padmanidhi, modeled in the round, dated to the Ishwaka period from Nagarjunakonda, had also inspired Sri Lankan art. Guard stones with the figures of Sankanidhi and Padmanidhi are numerous, and they were placed at the entrance of religious monuments. Merchants may have certainly had a special veneration for these divine yakshas, the patrons of wealth, holding a string of coins coming from the head. Among many patterns, highly inspired from the Andhra art, rare Roman motifs are attested on the stambas or the pillars on either side of the eastern Vahalkada of the Abhigiri Dagaba, depicting a Kalpavuksha, tree of life, in the form of a candelabrum, a candle tree, with a stem issuing from the Purnagata, decorated with familiar animals like elephants and humbuls, as well as the winged cupids and griffins, and foliage at each branch of the candelabrum, imitating the undulating acanthus leaves are all borrowed from the Greek and Roman art. A new era opened up in the relations between Rome and Sri Lanka during the reign of Emperor Claudius, following the accidental visit to the island of Annius Plocamus, the collector of the taxes in the Red Sea. It appears that it was following this visit that a delegation was sent from Sri Lanka to Rome. It is in this context that we can explain the Roman inspirations in Sri Lankan art. The Roman inspirations on Andhra art is amply discussed by Ronnie Grousset, C. Shivaramamurthy, and Elizabeth Rosenstone, comparing the Roman iconographies of the monetary types and reliefs, some significant scenes of motifs depicted in Andhra art. The earliest Sri Lankan contacts with Thailand, as revealed by iconographic similarities, goes back to the time of the Mon Kingdom of Dwaravati, which may have existed as early as the 5th century CE. The close links between Sri Lanka and Burma paved the way to iconographies based on Pali literature. The reliefs from Borobudur convey many stories related to the mariners. The relief depicting Rudrayana Avadana, a story from the Divya Vadana, explains how the Buddha gave the first illustration of the Bhava Chakra to King Rudrayana. This famous panel on the main wall of the first gallery depicts Rudrayana's the faithful minister Hiru arriving at his new house. The ship on the right is one of the best sources of information on ancient Indonesian ships. It appears it is equipped with outriggers and several sails. Compared to the depictions of the vessels attested in Indian coins, paintings and reliefs, the one in Borobudur reveals the development in shipbuilding and navigation facilities in the 9th century. From the 7th century onwards, Chinese, Arab, Persian and South Indian merchants developed their trade with Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. I am sure we are going to discuss it tomorrow. It was during the peak of this movement between East and West that the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara and his consort Tara became popular as protector of sailors in whole of Asia. I have spoken in detail in different forums about the preliminary results obtained from the Avalokiteshvara survey project launched by the Center for Buddhist Studies, UC Berkeley, and the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, in collaboration with the Department of Archaeology in Sri Lanka, using GIS mapping software to uncover spatial and temporal patterns. This project aim was to investigate the relationship between Buddhism and maritime trade in Sri Lanka and beyond. When the true cult of Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara as the patron of mariners, confronted by the inevitable perils of distant voyages, began to gain popularity in Sri Lanka from the 7th century onwards, his images were erected in sanctuaries built at the mouths of rivers or bays facing the sea or inland along the navigable rivers. The allocated time is not enough to discuss all the positive results we have obtained so far. So let me briefly say a few words. There are 3 types of sculptures of Avalokiteshvara were recorded during our survey: bronze statues, rock-cut images, and stone statues in the round, and especially the one that I mentioned, Sanjot, which was found a week back in Polonnaruwa with 2 images of Avalokiteshvara, where we went with Kelly on the other day. So that's the reason. Among many Buddha and Bodhisattva images found buried under the paving stone of a ruined meditation hall at Tiriyaya, the solid cast Bhumisparsha Mudra image of the Buddha seated in Vajrasana displaying the Bhumisparsha Mudra of the Pala style, and the statue was Padmapani Avalokiteshvara seated in Lalitasana, displaying the Varda Mudra, were certainly imported from Northeast India. The terracotta votive Buddha ceiling, Satsa, found there were hundreds of them, in Ashokaram in Anuradhapura, are of great importance with this regard. The Buddha Sakyamuni is depicted seated in Vajrasana, making the Bhumisparsha Mudra, surrounded by miniature stupas. Examining their style and iconography, Kunsong Nagmal Lama came to the conclusion that they were imported from Nalanda in Bihar. Among many statues imported to Sri Lanka, the bronze statues of four-headed Lokeshwara holding Padma, Kamandalu, Ashkamala and Pushtaka from Khmer dating to the 9th century, found in Deundara, the famous seaport at the most southern tip of the island, shows the maritime connections of Sri Lanka with Cambodia and the importance of the cult of Avalokiteshvara. The present survey was also enable us, especially to Kelly, to discover the hitherto unknown inscriptions, images, votive tablets denoting both Mahayana and Vajrayana concepts. The most important discovery in this regard is an inscription of the Vajradhatu Mandala, studied at length by Kelly Powell of the UC Berkeley, witnessing the presence and practice of Tantric Mahayana or Vajrayana in the Sri Lankan capital of Anuradhapura in the 8th and 10th centuries. The expansion of Tantric Buddhism from India to South and Southeast Asia is also linked with the extension of maritime activities towards China. The visit of Vajrabodhi to Sri Lanka and then to China was a result of the eastward expansions. Maritime route that Persian ship took with Vajrabodhi on board was the same as that frequented by Sinhalese bhikshunis, nuns, on their way to southern China. The Chinese sources record during the period from the last years of the Zhou to the Tang, 11 Sinhalese embassies to China, just as the arrival of Sinhalese nuns, who were at the origin of the great development of female monasticism in China. Vajrabodhi and his disciple Amoghavajra, masters of esoteric Buddhism in the Tang capital, enjoyed hospitality of the Tang emperor. As a conclusion, let me recall that seafaring traders and caravan merchants were no doubt interested in the exchange of commodities to make profits. Not only to make profits, but they were also, as revealed by epigraphic, literary and iconographic evidence, the earliest donors and important patrons of Buddhist establishments in South and Southeast Asia. I have to confess, this paper has only scratched the tip of the iceberg because, first of all, the iconographies discussed in this paper represent only a minute part of the existing documentation. And secondly, further research has to be done to comprehend how the Buddhist iconographies developed in a cross-fertilized context, ingeniously incorporating the sentiments and aesthetics of their respective populations. Studying these aspects can provide us with insight into the understanding of the aspirations and motivations of the donor traders and of the geographical and chronological growth of the maritime networks.